welcome in everyone to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Excuse me. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Thursday, December 5th around here, and we have a great show for you today. It is all about picks today. We will get into the SEC Championship to start things off. Then we'll move over to the Big Ten Championship, a huge game between Oregon and Penn State. We'll get to the ACC one, maybe the most impactful championship of them all. Definitely could knock Bama out of the race if Clemson were to win. And then we'll finish it off with the Arizona State-Iowa State game, a huge one in the Big 12 that will decide one of the playoff spots. One will be in, one will be out. And then we'll get to the biggest questions as we head into the CFP. A lot of different things that I want to talk about, including, is Bama still Bama? Are they still the team that just needs a foot in the dance and then they can really make some noise? So definitely something to watch there, and we'll get into that throughout the show. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have fun back and forth here, is to use that super chat. At the bottom of the chat on the Sports Network page, you can click that $, add any question, comment you'd like. It'll pop up on the screen, and we can have fun back and forth here. Definitely want this to be as interactive as possible for you all, so definitely drop any questions you have in the comments, and we can definitely get to them as soon as possible. But let's go ahead and jump into this one, because it's a special one. There's no two ways about that. It is the only rematch on the board this weekend, other than UNLV Boise State. The only rematch in the Power Four at the very least. But it's a huge one. Georgia's trying to do the exact same thing they were able to do in Austin earlier this year. Went in, got 7 sacks, 10 tackles for loss, got a 15-point win. Totally dominated that game pretty much from start to finish. Texas made a little bit of a push late in the second half, but for the most part, that was Georgia's game. They owned it. They dominated it. So this is something that Texas trying to flip the script. Georgia's trying to do essentially the exact same thing, and they're in kind of their second home in Mercedes-Benz, about 10 minutes from me, actually. But the one thing that I will say about this game is I think both teams are better right now than they were when they first faced off, and I think it comes down to one factor for for either team, where when you walked into that game back on October 19th with Carson Beck, you were thinking, okay, if he can avoid mistakes, we have to feel really good about this game. He wasn't able to. He threw 3 picks in that game, really struggled to see the field effectively, made a lot of mistakes, had a couple of plays where Texas just made a great play, but also missed a couple of guys that he should not have missed. It was one of those games where he just kind of was a little bit all over the place. He's not that way anymore. He's had 11 touchdowns, 0 picks in his last 3 games. He's been absolutely perfect over the last little bit, and that's a huge factor going in Georgia's direction. For Texas, I think it comes down to the run game. It was not a scary group when they first met. It was one of those groups where you can really pin your ears back and get after this offensive line, because you didn't have to worry about the run game all that much. You were allowed to commit more guys to the pass rush because the run game was not going to burn you. Now you have Trey Wisner, who's gone for over 150 yards in back-to-back weeks, has set career highs in back-to-back weeks, and is a very dangerous runner. The offensive line is absolutely rolling. The one question for this offensive line going into this game is Kelvin Banks is still a little bit up in the air for this game, the very talented left tackle that they have. Trevor Gooseby did come in against A&M and did an incredible job, so hopefully, regardless of what happens, they will be fine at that offensive line position, but that is a very impactful player. That is a player that, if you have a younger guy out there, there's more that Kirby Smart can do to someone like that than someone like Kelvin Banks. So definitely someone that Texas wants on the field on Saturday, but could leave a little bit of an opening where maybe Trevor Gooseby has to go, and then Georgia's edge rushers that we saw last time could maybe feast just a little bit more than they would be able to against Kelvin Banks. So that's definitely something that I'm watching very closely. And I think when you're talking about this offensive line, you got to talk about Quinn Ewers. You got to talk about that injury that he's dealing with right now, the high ankle sprain that kind of hobbled him a little bit against A&M, had a little bit of a scoot, which was very nice to see. So I think he's feeling more than fine to play this game. The question is, how effective will he be? And the question is, how well can he move? I think he did a great job against A&M early. I also think there's a number of things that Georgia can do that maybe A&M wasn't quite as capable of doing. So the question is, if Georgia is able to stop the run the way they did the first time around, where Texas had 27 carries, 29 yards on the ground, there's almost no chance this is going to go well for someone like Quinn Ewers, who is still hobbled with an injury, is still going to be attacked from every direction from this pass rush. If he doesn't have a run game to complement him, it's going to be really, really tough to figure this out. On the Georgia side for the run game is another big-time question, where last time you had Trevor Etienne, and he was a huge player in this game, had 3 touchdowns, over 100 total yards, was a huge player for Georgia in this one, and he likely will not go on Saturday. I believe is questionable on the injury report right now, but I expect him not to go in this one. They'll have to have other guys step up. Roderick Robinson should be a little bit more healthy than he was a week ago. Nate Frazier continues to get better as his season goes on, but definitely something to watch as you get a little bit closer to this thing where you have two run games that Texas seems to be trending in the right direction, Georgia seems to be trending in the wrong one, and could that have a huge effect on this game where maybe Georgia can't pin their ears back quite as much as they want to. Maybe Texas can't do that or is able to stop the run a little bit more effectively than they were the first time around. So a lot of different things going into this one. And then you add the quarterback run game into this where maybe Texas unlocks Arch Manning just a little bit. And we'll talk about that here in a second. But these teams feel like they can win national titles. Georgia is one of those teams that has been pretty up and down this year and has been a little bit hard to get a beat on. Definitely a team that you can bet on or not bet on. I fully understand it either way. I think they are a team that has that top-end capability. We saw it the first time they played in Austin. We could see it on Saturday, and then they just go on their merry way to win a national title. On the other side of that is these two teams have that bottom-out effect. They have that game where everything looks a little bit out of whack. Georgia had it against Kentucky and Ole Miss. Texas has had it against Georgia earlier in the year where things just look weird. So it's one of those matchups where you could get a number of different things, frankly. I think that you could get so many different things, but the way that I look at it right now, I think these two teams are playing better football than they were when they came in the last time around. I think the Georgia defense is a question mark going into this one, but you have a hobbled quarterback, you have an offensive line that might be dealing with some injuries. Maybe Georgia can jump into this thing, and then we'll have to see how it affects the CFP. Could UGA drop below Ohio State with a loss? Could Texas jump to the number 1 seed if Oregon were to fall, or would they drop to Notre Dame spot, or would they drop to UGA spot with a loss? So a lot of different things to talk about in terms of the CFP. We'll get into some of the hypotheticals tomorrow, actually, but I wanted to get into some players to watch here really quickly. And we'll start with Nate Frazier. We talked about it. It's likely that Trevor Etienne is not going to go in this game. You need someone to pick up the slack, and Nate Frazier is likely going to be that guy, one way or the other. He is a huge player, played really well last time they were in this building at the beginning of the year against Clemson, so has to feel relatively comfortable where he's playing, but definitely a player that is going to be huge for this title run for Georgia, where he's probably going to be carrying most of the weight. I think Roderick Robinson will take a little bit off of that more and more as the season goes on, but this is a huge player. One way or the other, he's going to have to make a ton of plays, and if he can't, then this Georgia defense is going to be really hard for Carson Beck to deal with. And then you got Mykel Williams on the defensive side of the ball for UGA. This is the guy that can totally change this game because he's not just a pure pass rusher. He is a guy that can get after the passer plenty, but he absolutely is very good in the run game as well. And I think when you look at a number of the different things that I think Texas is going to break out, I think he's going to have to be very disciplined. I think he's going to have to keep his feet still, make sure that he's parallel to the line of scrimmage, and then be able to chase down the quarterback or the running back. And the reason I say that is I think Arch Manning is going to have an effect in this game. I think he's going to have an impact. I think that moment right there is going to have an impact where you have that mesh concept and you got to figure out if he's going to pull it or he's going to keep it. And that is not an easy thing to do. It keeps a lot of these athletes that Georgia has at bay. It's not something that Texas had the first time around, and especially not something that you had where you were really scared of the running back that was getting the ball. Now Trey Wisner is definitely guys that Georgia is going to be at least cognizant of, at least a little bit worried about, and definitely one of those moments where maybe Arch Manning can be a huge factor in this game. We saw what Haynes King can do. Arch Manning's got plenty of athletic ability to do that as well. So definitely something to watch. I think he will have an impact on this game running the ball just because the opening is there against this Georgia defense. And then Andrew Makuba. He had an incredible game the first time these two played, made a ridiculous pick on the first one for Carson Beck in that game, and was really remarkable and has been ever since. He's been one of the best players on the back end for this Texas defense, has been one of the best players on Texas' team overall for the last little bit. So when you talk about this game, there's so many different things that have to happen for Texas, but the biggest thing is you got to confuse Carson Beck. One way or the other, you have to find a couple of mistakes from him, and this back end's going to have their hands full, Andrew Makuba especially, with a couple of these tight ends that they like to play. He's going to have to get a couple of man coverage concepts, and it'll be interesting to see if he can handle all of that. But definitely a couple of players that I think are going to have huge impacts on this game, but there are obviously plenty more of them. I do think Arch Manning is going to be a huge one to watch, but some keys to the game for Texas. Just play mistake-free football. They are incredibly hard to stop when they don't help you stop them, when they don't get penalties and turnovers and things that end drives earlier than they should. They are an incredibly hard team to stop. They have one of the best offensive lines in the country, have playmakers all over the field where you just have to get it in their hands and let them go to work. They have a running game that is now officially terrifying. they can do a lot of really special things offensively. They can't do them if they're turning the ball over. We saw it against A&M. It was domination until they gave that pick six away, until they fumbled. It felt like Texas was going to run away with that game, win 31-0 or something. They allowed them back in that game. You have to be very careful, and if you make a couple of those mistakes, the offense on the other side is going to be more potent than what you had against A&M last week. But the other part of this is force one-dimensional football. One way or the other, you have to find a way to slow down this run game, and it's been relatively easy to for a lot of the teams that this Georgia team has played, especially without Trevor Etienne. They're all the way near 100 in the country in rush yards per game. It's going to be really tough for them to get it going in if Texas is able to kind of plug that inside. They played really, really well. Those defensive tackles in Verdon Broughton and Alfred Collins have been absolute units. If they can play a big-time game here and force them to be one-dimensional, maybe Carson Beck starts forcing into those windows that he's been really good about not forcing it into the last couple of weeks. And then you're at home, but you're on the road. Texas is technically the home team in this game. Atlanta's Georgia country. I grew up in Atlanta. I'm about 10 minutes from Mercedes-Benz right now. Atlanta is Georgia country. They will be technically in enemy territory going into that game. It's going to be a really, really tough environment to kind of stick around in to make sure that you are totally even-keeled in. It's going to be very interesting to see what Texas does in this game where, yes, you are the home team, but I promise you, you are going to be on the road in this game. And then keys to the game for Georgia. It's going to be a change of approach. There's no doubt about that. The Texas run game is a real factor in this game like it wasn't when they first played. They have to make sure they have Trey Wisner in their sights. They have to make sure that they don't get caught by any quarterback run game or any concepts like that. And then on top of that, you got to make sure that your back end is fully set in this game. You got to make sure that you're not getting beat over the top. You got to make sure that you're not getting beat just on normal routes where guys can run around you, because that was a problem in the Georgia Tech game. Texas got some better athletes than Georgia Tech does. So you have to be very careful if you're Georgia. Definitely change the approach a little bit, not just pin your ears back and go after Quinn Ewers with the pass rush. And then high percentage throws. We talked about it. This back end is different than just about anything that Georgia has faced in quite some time, really since they faced this back end, if I'm being totally honest. But you look at a Florida team where he made a couple of mistakes. That is a very capable linebacker group that can drop back into coverage. I think Tennessee is a group that you can probably attack a little bit more on that back end. So while he's had incredible games and he's played really good football, you got to make sure you don't get ahead of yourself. You got to make sure you don't start forcing it into those tight windows. You don't start doing some relatively dangerous stuff. Trust your arm, of course. It's one of the best arms in the country, but definitely be cognizant of all these back-end players and the fact that they can make plays that can totally change a game in a hurry. And then they do have the special teams edge. This could be a huge one if it's a close game late in it, and Texas has really struggled in the kick and punt game this year. Georgia has not. They've been one of the best in the country in both categories. It could be a huge factor in this game. If it comes down to it, you have to make a kick late. Georgia's going to be more equipped to do that than Texas is. So definitely a lot of stuff going into this game. It is a rematch. It is going to have a lot of juice about it, and I think it's going to be a really fun one. I'm going to go with Texas. I think this run game is a huge factor in it. I think this defense, especially the defensive line, is playing as well as anyone in the country right now. I think it's just going to be too much. I think Texas has enough in this game. I think that run game with Trey Wisner is going to be a huge factor, and I do think Arch Manning with his legs is going to be a factor in this game. I think it'll be a little bit too much for Georgia. I'll pick Texas to win that one. I think it's going to be an awesome one down there in Atlanta. I'll pick Texas to win, possibly lock up that number one seed, depending on what happens in this next game that we'll talk about. Oregon against Penn State, a huge one over there in Indianapolis. Got to talk about it right after this, so stick with us.